up, I'll let him in.
Okay, we might as well get started now. So just want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us for this is the third and final installment of our Virtual Forage Masterclass with Dan Undersander. My name is Gary Koziel. I'm the Senior Ag Rep with the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture, and I'm filling in for Daniel Muir today. Daniel's with us, but he has lost his voice, so I will be the voice of Daniel for today's session. And once again, we have Scotia Fraser is providing our tech support from the Nepan office. And we also have with us Lindsay Scott from Perennia, who is also providing tech support. So we are once again very proud to bring you, Dr. Dan Undersander, the Forage Professor Emeritus of University of Wisconsin. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Dr. Dan Undersander has worked as a forage specialist for 50 years. His areas especially include forage production, forage harvesting, hay, haylage, and baleage, forage analysis, and grazing. He is a fellow of both the American Society of Agronomy and Crop Science Society of America. He has more than 1,800 publications in forage production and utilization. And Dan has traveled the world working in 58 countries, helping farmers improve the quality and yields of their forages in Asia, Europe, North America, and South America. So today's session, to wrap it up, is making good silage, alfalfa, grass, and corn. And I'm thinking maybe you saved the best for last, did you, Dan?
Well, I think it is a good topic, near and dear to my heart, Gary.
For sure. So as with previous sessions, we're going to ask that you hold your questions, or you can put them in the chat, and we'll get to them at later in the presentation or near the end of the presentation. And I also want to let you know that this session is being recorded. And in the future, in very near future, it'll be you'll be able to view it on the Perennia website once that gets posted. So with that, I'll ask you to sit back and relax and put on your forage hats and help me virtually welcome Dan Undersander once again for our third and final presentation. So I'll swing it over to you, Dan.
Well, first off, I intend to go about an hour, and then we should have about half an hour for questions if the audience has questions, and I presume they will. Secondly, I'm going to start with a 3 or 4 minute review of the ensiling I covered 2 weeks ago with corn silage. And then we'll talk about some general characteristics about ensiling, then bunkers and tubes. And then lastly, we'll talk about making baleage, which I think has a lot of opportunity for all of Nova Scotia. So with that,
just before you get going, Dan, we're seeing your notes format, not the full screen slides.
You're seeing what?
The notes format of PowerPoint, not the full screen slides.
Well, I wonder why that would be.
We're looking at a different screen. Maybe can you share your presentation screen?
Okay, let's see if, whoop, I lost it.
I think if you click up slideshow and
I have lost all of the screen except your pretty faces.
Oh,
we
no.
We are looking at your presentation.
I don't know how to get the screen back let's see if we can see what hide thumbnail, show.
Do you have 2 monitors running, Dan?
Yes.
And you don't see your PowerPoint on either monitor?
Well, I minimized it. I can bring it up.
Yeah.
There.
Start the slideshow again and let me see what we see.
Do you see a slideshow now?
No, but if you go up to display settings at the top there.
Now I see that it's being hidden by this session is being recorded.
Yeah.
Hit OK on that
I'll
button.
click OK.
Yeah.
Share.
In your PowerPoint, there we go. Perfect.
You got it.
Okay, so I'm on
Continue
to the
on.
second slide, which is the 5 stages of fermentation, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Hey, you guys got to at least nod your head once in a while or something.
Yeah.
So the 5 phases are the anaerobic or aerobic, excuse me. When you first put the silage in, because of the oxygen that has to be removed from that silage, you have some aerobic fermentation. We have a lag phase, a fermentation phase, a stable phase, and then a feed out phase. And so with all silage making, the aerobic phase is really a loss. That's when the silage heats. That's when you have potentially undesirable fermentation, but mainly heating and energy loss. And I think everyone should be aware of this. If you've ever left a load of silage in a wagon or a truck overnight, you know how hot it is the next morning. And that's due to the respiration that's going on and due to and that heating, and recognize heating as the loss of energy that you could be feeding your animals if that heating did not occur. So this is why we say that bunkers should be filled preferably within 1 day, possibly 2, but certainly no longer. This is why we want to wrap bales quickly. In all cases, the purpose is to get the hay into storage facility and then packed or wrapped or whatever, so that the oxygen can be removed by respiration with minimal respiration, let's put it that way. And then once that happens, then what happens is that the lag phase begins. The anaerobic bacteria that cause the fermentation begin to grow, and then they ferment after their population builds up, and they reduce the acid of the silage, and then eventually get so acidic that the bacteria themselves are killed. Once that fermentation has occurred and the pH is dropped, we have a stable phase with the silage. And that silage, again, whether it's a tower, a bunker, a tube, or wrap baleage, will preserve that forage for as long as it remains anaerobic without oxygen. I've been in some old tower silos that had silage from 20 years preceding that was still as good as when it was put in, because that silo had remained anaerobic and had preserved that silage. So no problem with long preservation if you get good fermentation. And then we have the feed out phase that we talk about. When we open up any tower, bunker, tube, whatever, or unwrap a bale, that bale is exposed to oxygen, and then we begin respiration. It begins to heat, and is something we need to pay attention to. So what I really want to stress to you from these slides that I went through is that all ensiling is the same process. All ensiling works the same regardless of the crop, whether it's corn or small grain or grass or alfalfa or clover. They all go through these same phases. There are a few minor differences, but it's basically the same process. And with any ensiling, we have the same concerns that we have to work with in terms of shutting off the oxygen supply quickly, and then allowing the fermentation to occur. Now, so how do we make good silage? Well, the first thing is that we need to ensile at 60 to 65%. And again, this is the moisture we should shoot for, irregardless of the crop we are ensiling, whether it's corn or wheat oats or timothy or clovers or alfalfa, we want to be in that 60 to 65% moisture range. This is where we have adequate moisture for good fermentation, but not excessive to allow seepage or clostridial fermentation or some of the other undesirable traits. It's also at 60%, it's enough moisture to pack well and allow fermentation. If we go below 60%, we don't get good packing and don't get good fermentation. We don't have adequate moisture for the bugs. Now we can wrap bales, and I'll tell you about it, much drier than 60, but then we don't get fermentation. We just have the plastic wrap keeping the oxygen out. But if we want ensiling and if we want fermentation, we have to put that silage up at 60 to 65% moisture. Now, how do you tell the moisture? Some of you, if you have some contract harvesters with some of the new bigger choppers, may have an NIR on them that can tell the moisture content of the material as it's entering the chopper wagon or truck. Some units come off the chopper and you can have them in a shop over winter, as shown there on the right, and we can measure the moisture from the face of the silage that we are harvesting. And that becomes critical because moisture on the face of a bunker or a pile changes significantly depending on whether it's been raining or the sun's been shining. Another method is microwave, where we chop the forage, and again, it doesn't make any difference what the forage is, into 6 centimeter lengths or less. We microwave it, stir it, microwave it, and then we start repeating that process and wait with 1 minute intervals and weighing each time on a postal scale until there is no moisture loss. And then we can calculate the moisture that was originally in the sample. I said a couple weeks ago with corn silage, a person could actually take a sample and run it into a lab and have it analyzed, because then you can predict a moisture decline and harvest it. That works for corn silage, but not very good for any other forage. So we need to think about these. Another way of testing moisture is with a Koster tester. And that basically has an infrared lamp in that box at the bottom with a fan. It blows air up through the top, and that container with the handle has a screen on it. You put your sample in there, you blow that hot air through it, and then periodically weigh it on a postal scale until there's 0 weight loss. And then the total weight loss from the start to the end is what your moisture content was. Now, just for curiosity's sake, we've had a few farmers build their own Koster tester, because Koster testers run them close to $500. So what they did was took a piece of PVC pipe. As you can see, they cut a hole in it. They went into the house and took their wife's hair blower. Should ask first, probably. And then they put a colander on top, and the one on the right is a purchased pan with a screen, but you could just use a kitchen colander as well and sit it in there. And again, I would suggest you ask first, but these are cheap ways. You're basically drying the forage, and then you take that container off and weigh it periodically until there is no weight loss, and that will give you your dry matter content. So know the moisture you're starting at. And that's important because different forages feel different at a given 60% moisture content. When I had some of our farm crews switch from alfalfa to making some grass silage, in every case they were too wet because it felt different. We didn't check it. And so it is important to check a couple to know how the moisture content feels for that particular crop when it is 60 to 65% moisture. Now, the next step then is to pack well to exclude air. And I will say that this has been the biggest reason for poor silage that we've had in the Midwest. When we had tower silos, packing wasn't a problem. As long as the silage was distributed uniformly across the diameter, the weight above packed the silage below, and it fermented well. As we go to bunkers and tubes, then we have to pack by with tractors, with other methods. And in fact, we did some studies, and even if we're making those long sausage tubes, the way that the person puts the silage into the tube determines the amount of packing. We did an exclusion with 2 different packers, 2 different kinds of machines. And in both cases, one driver packed the silage more in the tube than the other individual did with either machine. So packing is a key thing. And we would suggest it's probably one of the most important things. When I grew up, it was Dad always drove the chopper. But really, on a bunker now, Dad should be on the packing tractor or some of the most experienced person. Let's just talk a little bit about heating. And again, it is a moisture energy loss. You see there a round bale that was wrapped, brown in the middle, it heated. Cattle like it better because when heating makes, among other things, gives off carbon dioxide, and that's the energy loss. But it makes mallard products, which are combining amino acids and sugars. We like mallard products. That's why we brown a steak. And I can give you a number of other examples in cooking. But cattle like the feed better. It's just worth less. The other thing is that heating does indicate mold growth and the potential for greater growth there. So the key thing is actually from packing is the amount of pore space that you have. The more pore space that you have after packing, the more oxygen you have and the more heating that is going to occur. So the recommendation of research would be that you want less than 40% porosity, 0.4 or less porosity. Now that means that when you're packing it, you still have 40% airspace in there, but that's about as good as you can get. At 0.4 porosity, that means about 705 kilograms per cubic meter at 35% dry matter. And I usually like to use that as fed or 35% dry matter. That would be 65% moisture. Or some scientists like to think in terms of dry matter, that same amount is 225 kilograms of dry matter per cubic meter. Now that's a lot, but that's what you should be shooting for if you want to keep the porosity down. Now, lower porosity is beneficial for 2 reasons. The first thing is you've got less air in there immediately, and so less heating occurred as the silage is starting to be made. But also, if you have less porosity, when you start to feed out that silage or when you open that baleage up to be fed, oxygen moves less into the bale and the bale starts less heating. Now, we would suggest that if you're at about 750 kilograms per cubic meter, that air will penetrate about 60 meters from the face. This is our recommendation for removing 30 centimeters per day from the face of a bunker or a pile, because that way the oxygen is only with the silage for 2 days at most before it is taken off and fed out. Now, if on the other hand, you're at way less than 700 kilograms per cubic meter, then the oxygen will penetrate farther than 60 meters, as much as 1 or even 2 meters into the face. And then that silage will be in the presence of oxygen for 3, 4, or 5 days before it is fed. So density is important, and removing 30 centimeters per day from the face of a bunker or a pile is important. I'm going to tell you it's also important for baleage in a minute too. So packing is key. You may or may not have tractors like this in your region, but the point would be do whatever you can to get the heaviest tractor possible. You see that one in the upper right that has a cement block on the 3-point hitch. And you see on the lower left, he has weights on the back and on behind the blade. The maximum amount of weight you can get. I have seen people use machines for packing roads to pack. I've seen people use concrete trucks full of concrete to pack. Packing is important. If you're making a bunker pile, one of the considerations is if you don't have a big enough tractor, maybe you should rent one for the day or two you need it to get the packing that's necessary. Let's think a little bit about packing and what it takes. We have this spreadsheet made that's available to y'all. Gary, I can, or Scotia, send it to you guys if you don't have it, and you can make it free to the audience. I'm not a good businessman. But if we look at this packing here, these are the major factors that affect packing density. You look at the top row there, it's silage pile height. I put in 3 meters, skip the next pink one. The width at 33 meters. The rate of delivery at 50 tons as fed per hour. I'm sure yours is different, but you can or should figure out what it is. 50 tons is a good number. Some do quite a bit more, some do less. The silage dry matter content should be a decimal number, and I just picked 0.34. The layer thickness at 15 centimeters. Now, those are the key factors that affect packing. I want you to note that it doesn't specify the species. It makes no difference whether it's corn or alfalfa or grass. It doesn't specify a chop length, and as long as it's less than about a 4 or 6 centimeter chop length does not make any difference. So these are the factors we have to play with. You can take this spreadsheet and plug it in on your farm. What I want you to notice is that for those parameters, and I don't know how close that is to what you all are using, but bringing in 50 tons an hour and a 15 centimeter packing layer thickness, that person needed a 17,000 kilogram tractor to pack that silage sufficiently to get down to, if you look there, he's at 709.7 kilograms per cubic meter. That's a little bit better than 705, so that's good. And the dry matter is about 240, that's good. And our porosity is 0.39, which is less than 1. But it took that big of a tractor at that filling rate to pack that silage to what we would expect. And I would ask how many of you are doing that. Now, the other option is that you could put 2 tractors in. And that needs to be done more than what people realize. So the only difference between this and the previous graph is that I did lower the tractor rate to 12,000 kilos a tractor, and I put 2 of them in. And I might say I've got them both operating 100% time. That's one of the things you want to pay attention to is you got to keep the packing tractors packing. I was at a bunker someplace in the world, I won't say where, and he just was not getting packing in spite of having big tractors and everything looking, according to our sheet, it should have been working. So I told the fellow, the manager, I said, well, let's go around behind the side of this building and see what happens. And as soon as we were out of sight, the guys shut down their tractors and went and had a cup of coffee. Well, that does not pack the silage. So the time that it runs is also important. But I want you to notice that with these two lighter tractors, we did get up to our 709 kilograms per cubic meter, 241, and we were at a porosity of less than 0.4. So that's good. Now, so one thing you can do to increase packing is to add weights. Another thing you can do is to add tractors. But a third thing that you can do, I put a little red star there, you could go to a thinner packing layer. And if you went down to 10 centimeter packing layer instead of 15, then I want you to notice that with a 11,300 pound tractor, we got our over 705 kilograms. So you can increase packing by adding weight. You can increase packing by adding tractors. You can increase packing by thinning the layer that you're packing. And those are three options that should be played with to think about getting the density that we'd like to see. Now, let's just look at a bunker. And I show you a picture of the bunker. I've got an arrow pointing to the bunker wall, a yellow arrow pointing to the top of the face of the pile, and a yellow arrow pointing to the bottom of the face. Now, if we take an infrared picture of that, that infrared tells us how much that face is heating as it's being fed out. And the green at the bottom is well packed and not heating. The red layer right at the top is heating quite a bit as that silage is there in the pile and being fed out. What this tells us is that the top of the pile was not packed as much as it should have been. My suspicion is that got towards the end of the day, they wanted to cover the pile, so they just quit packing. But then on feed out, what you see is that heating loss occurring. Here's an infrared of another bunker, and again, you can see packed pretty good at the lower right. It's green, but not so good across the top. Here is another bunker that he didn't pack very good at the lower right, and then got better as the bunker filled. It is important to remember that you must pack uniformly at every depth in the bunker. You can't simply go on top of a pile and expect the bottom layers to pack. That's the importance of that 10 centimeter thickness or 15 centimeter thickness. Here's another example of a bunker. You see that red spot off to the right? I figure this must have been a left-handed driver or something that wasn't packing as well as he might on the right side of the bunker. So packing is crucial. Packing is the biggest thing that we have had to work with as farmers shifted from tower silos to bunker or piles. And again, I will say even tubes need to be packed well. In fact, I was in Nova Scotia a couple years ago. A farmer had cattle that were sick, and somebody took me out to look at the farm. We went and looked at the silage, and the entire tube was covered with white mold. It just had not been packed enough. The farmer said, well, that was all he could get. And I said, well, you know, nothing would be better than that, or go to wrap bales or do something different. But a poor packing is not acceptable. The next thing is to use an inoculant when you're putting the silage in. I'm big on them. There's been work with enzymes, and they work well, but they're more expensive. We like the lactic acid bacteria because it's the less expensive route. Now, the purpose of inoculants is that the bacteria ferment sugars to make acids and help preserve the crop. Adding inoculants increases the density of the bacteria and increases the rapidity at which they start working. And so that's an important thing. They also, the second point there, ensure that fermentation goes the direction you want. Adding inoculants will cause the pH to drop more rapidly. It'll reduce heating loss. It'll reduce protein solubilization. And because you got the fermentation going a good way quickly, then you don't have butyric acid formed, you don't have Clostridia, you don't have some of the other problems that occur when the fermentation doesn't start as rapidly as it should. Now, there's all kinds of inoculants out there. I'd like to suggest to you that the major one we should be thinking about is Lactobacillus plantarum, the top one. That is the bacteria that ferments sugars into acids. It is kind of important as you're looking at different crops that you pick an inoculum specific for your crop, because some inoculums work better on some crops than others. We, for instance, took an inoculum for alfalfa and used it on grass, and it didn't work very well. So that is important to think whether you're doing corn silage or grass or alfalfa, you might want to look into having a different inoculum. The other bacteria that's used quite a bit is Lactobacillus buchneri. And this is the one, I'll tell you, if you aren't going to listen to me and if you aren't going to pack the silage like you should, this will help cover some of that deficiency. Because buchneri produces acetic acid, which is a better mold inhibitor than lactic acid. Buchneri is a little more expensive. Buchneri is slower to operate. Lactobacillus plantarum in most of our species should be operating within 3 or 4 days. Buchneri might take a couple months to be effective. So and in no case are any of these inoculums anything you should put on the silage at the feed bunk, because they just don't operate fast enough to do any good. I did list 4 other compounds you typically see in inoculums. They have some benefit in some cases. Some of them are more probiotics than actual fermentation enhancers. But the main thing to look for is the Lactobacillus plantarum and the buchneri if packing density is an issue. We do recommend 100,000 colony forming units per gram of forage. So do pay attention to that. Liquid inoculum is preferred over dry, though you can get dry and mix it in water and have it be liquid. If you are going to mix it yourself, be sure that you do not use chlorinated water. That will kill the bacteria. And then lastly, the inoculum should be applied at the chopper. Inoculum must cover every side of every leaf. It does not move. Think of inoculums as spray paint. It stays where it lands. And so if you don't cover every side of every leaf, you don't get the full benefit of the inoculum. In fact, let me just say there's a lot of people around the world that spray inoculum on top of the silage as it's in the bunker. They should save the money and not spend it on the inoculum, because it is not helping them. So do make sure that it is applied at the chopper. Now, the other question is it's inoculant for baleage. And of course, some people disagree with me, but the point would be that, again, the inoculum should be applied at the chopper chute to cover every piece of every particle as it goes into the truck or wagon. The problem with inoculants on a baler or making baleage is you can really only spray it on the top of the windrow. And there's been one study that showed some advantage to inoculum, but frankly, many have not shown an advantage. So it's iffy whether or not you should apply inoculum. You might be a little bit better off with propionic acid, which starts the acidity and then to allow the fermentation. Here are average fermentation analyses profiles of different silages. And again, I want you to look at the first line. They're all put up at 60 to 65% moisture. Now, generally speaking, corn silage on the far right gets the lowest pH. It's the most acidic. Legumes, particularly alfalfa, buffer quite a bit. And so the acid has to overcome the buffering capacity. So they generally don't get as acid as corn silage. Grass silage in this data is a little bit higher in pH. It's less acid. And the reason being that the grasses have less of the sugars for fermentation. And so unless they're in a really good stage, we can get good fermentation, but it's generally not as much as with the other two types of products. In all the cases, our acetic acid should be 6 to 8 or 10%. After it's fermented, you can have an analysis done and check that. The acetic acid should be 1 to 3% unless you are adding Buchneri and wait 3 or 4 months to sample. Then your acetic acid could go as high as 4 to 6% at the expense of the lactic acid. We'd like not to see much ethanol. We get that in corn silage because of all the starch in the kernel. The other thing that we look at is the ammonia nitrogen, which tends to be a little bit higher in alfalfa or clovers because they have a higher crude protein to start with. So start at the right moisture, pack it well, use an inoculant, cover or wrap it within 2 days, preferably 1, but 2 at the outside. I don't have much in the way of pictures on this, but if you can't fill it in 2 days, you might consider making a smaller pile, 2 smaller piles that can be made and covered within 2 days. You might consider a smaller bunker that you can make or cover within 2 days. And again, the idea being that the longer you leave it uncovered, the more you have oxygen in that silage, the more it heats, the more mallard products you have, and the more energy you have lost. Now, our recommendation, at least, also is to fill with a progressive wedge. Don't try to fill the whole bunker in one flat layer. If you use a progressive wedge, then you can cover the back that gets full while you're still filling the front. And that's an advantage. Now, a couple things. If you're using a bunker, cover the sides with plastic before you fill with silage. And then put plastic across the top and overlay it a couple meters. You see an example there of spoiled silage. I would like you to think of that really as being lost. Under no circumstances should you feed that to animals. That should be separated out and hauled back and spread on a field. Here's an example of some data where they took spoilage from silage, The good quality silage from the center of the bunker was about 63% digestible. They added 5.4, 10.7, and 16.4 spoilage. And you see that the digestibility of the entire silage that was being fed fell from 63 down to 52%. So mixing in that spoiled silage, not only was the stuff itself bad, but it reduced the digestibility of the good silage. Similarly, it had an effect on intake. The good silage, the intake was about just under 2.4% of body weight. And then with 16% spoilage, it was about 2.05% of body weight. So it fell 2 or 3% of body weight. So by mixing spoiled silage in with good silage, we reduce the digestibility of the entire silage and we reduce the feed intake, both of which would affect animal performance, whether it's weight gain or milk production. So cover the piles, bunkers with plastic. Tires are a good thing. Actually, we'd recommend half tires so that you can't have water accumulating in there and mosquitoes breeding and so on. An important consideration is to make sure that the slope of the face of a bunker or of a pile is not so steep that the tires slide off. You see in the middle left, the tires have slid off the pile, so they're not holding that plastic in place. Now, the other thing that I want to mention with this picture is that when you're feeding silage out, you may have a dark brown layer at the top, which indicates spoiled silage. I'd like you to keep in mind that that's not the amount that's spoiled. That's the amount that's left after the rotting occurred. And you actually lost 3 times as much silage as the thickness of that dark layer. So it can be significant. Since that is all over the top, it looks to me like this individual should use better plastic next time because there was oxygen coming through that plastic to create that spoilage. We do recommend that you keep a straight face on the silage. If you have an uneven face, it is more face exposed to oxygen. We also would recommend you take the silage out of a bunker pile with a rake or a rotary rather than a scoop on a tractor. If you go in with a bucket and scoop against this, you lift the silage up, you let oxygen back into that space that you created underneath the bucket, and that enhances oxygen going into the pile and increases your waste. Now, the other thing nobody likes to talk about, but I'm not in your state anyway, is make sure that you feed enough silage off the face every day. If you remember earlier in this talk, I said that if you pack it well, we'd still expect oxygen to move back 60 centimeters. So our recommendation is to take 30 centimeters per day off the face of the bunker or pile. And I suspect that many are not doing that. I just took an example here. If we're feeding 20 kilograms a day per silage to 100 cows, we need about a ton of forage a day. If we assume you did pack it well at 705, you can see that if the bunker is 5 meters wide and 1 meter high, we're taking off a little more than we need. But if you go down to a 2 meter height bunker, then the red there is the silage that you're short of what you should be taking off. And then if we go to a 10 meter wide bunker, which I think is probably not unusual, you see that with 100 cows, all of those numbers are red. There's no way that a person is taking off 30 centimeters per day from the face. And we should be thinking about that, how to be sure that we are so that we don't have the heating loss. And again, I will say that this problem of heating and silage loss is even worse if your silage isn't packed to that 705 kilogram per cubic meter density. All right, I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking a little bit about wrap bales and baleage. And I think, again, that this is a great opportunity for a lot of farms. Here is a graph of some losses that was published many years ago, but it's still good. What it shows, if you look at the orange area, is that the drier the hay, the bottom we have moisture content from 10 to 80. But for dry hay, we have a lot of harvest losses, but very little storage loss if you put it up dry and keep it off of the ground and so on. For treated hay, if you use propionic acid or something like that, you can reduce your losses depending on moisture content. It didn't be that we used to really have anything practical to deal with stuff over 35% moisture on up to our silage. But now that we can wrap bales in plastic, I'm going to tell you that we can wrap a bale anything from 20% moisture up to 70 and preserve it. And what you choose to do might depend on your management scheme. The important thing to keep in mind is that fermentation still depends on the moisture content of the baleage. And our best fermentation is around 60 to 65% moisture. If we go over 70, we'll get butyric acid fermentation. If we go below 60, we'll get less fermentation. Now, again, I'll tell you that you can still preserve wrapped bales with little or no fermentation, but recognize that fermentation only occurs at the higher moisture content. Let's step back a minute and think a little bit about heating and moisture losses. A number of studies were done where if we look at what we called heating degree days, and that was the temperature above 30 degrees centigrade. And what you see is that in all cases, the digestible NDF goes down, the digestible NFC goes down, and this means that the energy content of that forage is declining. So at moderate levels of heating, we're losing energy. At higher levels with bales, silage, but particularly hay, it can get hot enough to have a fire and burn. And here's somebody, I should have taken a picture the day before. He had these bales, round bales sitting along the roadside, and they all got hot enough and burned. And so it's important to watch the moisture that you put up things. If you can't do it below about 18%, don't do it, or wrap it or sile it or do something. I had one farmer call me a couple years ago. He was all excited. He said he just measured the hay in his hay mow and it was 70 degrees centigrade. I said, what should he do? I said, check your insurance. Maybe at that point, we can't open it up. We can't do anything to stop it. But if it's right on the line, it may gradually cool off and you'll have some charred hay, but barn will be okay. If he opens it up at 70 centigrade, most likely it will flare up and then he will have a fire. So do pay attention to heating and potential losses. One of the considerations with making baleage is, as much as I hate to tell people that they need to buy more expensive equipment, you do need to think about, if you're going to make baleage, you really should have a silage baler. A hay baler, I mean, just think about this. I apologize for the English units, but if you're making a 5 by 4.5 foot bale that has a dry weight of about 850 pounds, at 15% moisture, that's 1,000 pounds at the top for hay. That's what the hay balers are built for. But when we're making baleage at 60% moisture, that bale weighs over 2,000 pounds. I'm sorry, should have converted that to kilograms too. But anyway, you get the point. The bale weighs twice as much. And so it takes a heavier baler if you're really going to make it last and be available for you. Now, the other thing about silage balers is that they will make a more dense bale. And the same principle as with tubes or piles or bunkers, the bale density, and you see on the left scale there, we don't get as much density as we do in a pile. And I apologize, these are pounds per cubic foot. We go up to around 20 or 12 pounds per cubic foot. But the more dense the bale on the left, the lower the bale pH. None of them, as I told you, got as low as silage, but there was a difference between some at 5.2 and some at 5.8. Now, then as a part of that, if you're feeding round bales, the denser the bale, the longer the bale bunk life. And so what you see here is if that bale is down around 5 or 6 pounds per square foot, the bunk life on the left is much shorter than the bunk life on the right when the bale again is up at 8 or 10 pounds per cubic foot. Now, having said that, if you're going to feed a bale every day and it's going to be consumed, none of this is important. So if you're going to have the bale be consumed every day, then whether it ferments or not isn't that important. And in fact, it may be beneficial to make them somewhat lighter so that you have less weight to handle with your machinery. So bunk acidity and fermentation is only important if the bales are going to be exposed to oxygen for more than a day before they're consumed. Let me just talk about the mold growth that can occur in those bales. It concerns nutrients, starches, sugars. It respires, can cause hay fires. It produces mycotoxins. And this is one of the things I'm really concerned about. We've had some problems with that are detrimental to animal health, may decrease feed intake, and they produce spores, which can cause lung diseases in humans. And it certainly reduces the value of the hay. Now, this is actually from data from Winnipeg. They did identify all of these fungi in hay. Again, they're normally always, it's just like us having the cold virus. It's always present. It's not normally a problem. But if they are, they can produce a number of different diseases, both in animals and humans. I worked with one farmer that called up from northern Wisconsin. He had silage in a silo and it had mold on it. He was feeding it to his heifers and they were coughing. And then he started getting sick. And he asked what he could do about it. I said, well, nothing. I said, the main thing, you should stop feeding that. If you have to go in there, for instance, to unload it, you should have a mask on. And then haul it out on the field and spread it, but do not expect to feed it. Well, it turned out that apparently that was his only feed. He didn't see an alternative and he shot himself. So it can be a significant problem. So here are some examples. There's a big bale that they cut open with a chainsaw. You can see, and there's a good lesson here. The center is brown. That's what heated. The outside is not so brown, because the outside, the heat could dissipate to the air, but the outside insulated the interior part, and so we had more mold. I do want to show, and I'll probably show another picture, like on the right, that white mold is fairly it's innocuous. It's penicillium. But when you see that on the surface of a bale, that means that oxygen was coming through the plastic. That means either that your plastic was a cheap one and you should get a different one next year, or you didn't put on 6 wraps. 6 wraps of a good plastic, 8 or 10 of a cheap plastic. Now, a couple things then about that heating, though. You can bale hay without spoilage at a higher moisture content if you have things that allow the heat to diffuse. For example, in cool weather in the fall, you can bale a little bit wetter than in the summer. You can bale smaller bales a little bit wetter than bigger bales because there's less self-insulation. If you leave the bales singly rather than stack them, you can bale them a bit wetter. Some growers let bales sweat for a couple weeks and then stack them. But of course, in all cases, wrapping in plastic will cover whatever moisture situation you have in that bale. Here is some data from hay making for square bales. And what I want to show you is that the bigger the bale, the drier the hay has to be. We can bale small square bales as high as 20% and stack them loosely. They'll heat, but they'll dry out. I know there's some 3x3 balers in Nova Scotia, and you can bale with those up to 16%. Not as much as small bales because of the self-insulation. The large balers 4x4 are really for use in Western Canada and the United States. We don't use them here either because we can never get hay down to 14% to put in the bale. Round bales, it's the same kind of deal. The smaller the bale you make, the better it can be. And this is partly why I'm going to presume that you have largely medium round bales rather than the big ones, because that extra percent moisture is hard to get rid of. So as I said earlier, just to say again, we can wrap bales in plastic, anything between 20 and 70% moisture. Below 50%, we're depending totally on oxygen exclusion. Above 50%, we have both oxygen exclusion from the plastic and fermentation with acid production. And again, the only advantage of having fermentation is less spoilage on feed out if the bales are going to be out more than a day before they're consumed. One of the things that I do want to stress is I think when making baleage, it's a good idea to use a pre-cutter to cut that silage or that hay into 10 centimeter, even as long as 20 centimeter lengths. I got that right. Oh, anyway, 2 to 4 inches. Now, most of the pre-cutters on balers are set at 2 inches or 2.5. I recommend taking every other one out and going to about 4 inches, which should be about 10 centimeters. There we go. I'm getting it. The reason is that you don't need it cut more. The longer length makes the bales more stable. And 4 centimeters, if you think about it, is about the width of a cow's mouth. So she can take a bite of that and swallow it. The other problem with these pre-cutters is that stones can cause knife damage. And that's where you have to be a little bit careful when you form the windrows not to rake and beat on the ground and put into it. Now, the advantage of a pre-cutter is you get greater bale density. So as I was suggesting, they'll last a little bit longer before heating. Data has shown you get better feed intake by animals. And you can imagine if an animal can take a bite, chew it a little, and swallow it, it'll eat more than if it takes a long piece and has to chew it and let a piece fall off either side of its mouth and then go back and get another long piece. Because the feed intake goes up, the animal gain goes up. And then because you've got that 10 centimeter length, the animal can consume the whole thing. There's less feeding loss around bale feeders than if the forage is longer. So again, plastic preserves by excluding oxygen. We need at least 6 wraps. And I recommend getting a good plastic. Don't go to a discount store. Go to some places that sells baler wrapping machines, buy your plastic there. Paying a few cents extra is worth it. Now, we've done some studies on wrapping. I don't know if there's a potential in Nova Scotia, maybe in a few places, but a lot of farmers make their own bales and hire somebody to come in and wrap them. And so the question becomes, how fast does it have to be wrapped? Well, wait, first on this slide, this is our 6 layers of plastic. If you look at this, that purple line at the top is how hot the bale got that was unwrapped, but made it about 30% moisture. And I did this at 69 and the results were the same. If you look at the red line, a little lower, 2 mils or 2 layers of plastic did restrict oxygen coming in, did keep the bale a bit cooler, but it was still heating at 40 degrees centigrade rather than air temperature. And if you follow those lines down to the blue lines at the bottom, when we put 6 layers of plastic on, then the temperature started falling immediately and it fell down to air temperature on about day 8 or 9. So 6 layers of plastic, let the bale heat a little, cool off, and go back to air temperature, where lesser layers always allowed oxygen to come in. And again, those bales with less than 6 mils were still heating at 3 weeks and would have heated for a long time after. The other thing is what I was just started to say before, how fast does a bale have to be wrapped after it's made? Our recommendation is within 24 hours. But what this graph shows you is anytime you wrap is better than not wrapping at all. And so again, if you look at the top purple line is the unwrapped, and you can see that it went up to 50, 55 degrees centigrade and stayed there for 3 weeks. Day 1 is the day the bales were wrapped. So if you look at 0 and wrapped immediately, it did heat a little bit up to about 38 and then cooled down to air temperature in about 8 days and stayed there. If you didn't wrap it for 24 hours, it did heat up to 50, but immediately cooled down, and similar with 48 hours. So this study and others would tell us that wrapping within 24 hours of baling is best. But again, any wrapping of wet hay at any time is better than not wrapping, because immediately you cut off the oxygen supply and you reduce the heating and respiration and mold growth. Inline wrappers are good. They save about 40% plastic. The thing is that really they're only better for larger herds, because we should take about 3 bales a day off the end to stay ahead of spoilage, because as with bunkers and other piles, the oxygen does move in from the end. do buy good quality plastic. Here's some that wasn't. The main difference of good quality is that, of course, it's a little denser and inhibits oxygen permeation through it, but it also has UV inhibitors, which keeps it from breaking down in sunlight. So as a rule of thumb, individually wrapped bales are most appropriate for individuals with less than 50 cattle to feed. Once you get above that, then that's an awful lot of plastic there on every bale. And then once we're above 50, we generally can use inline wrappers because we can feed 2 or 3 bales a day off the front. So in summary, cut forage for high yield and the needed quality. If we're baling, bale with a pre-cutter, wrap within 24 hours, and wrap with at least 6 layers. I'm going to just show one other thing, quick digression. Hopefully you all are not using side wheel rakes. One of the biggest things that we have with them, since they're ground driven, is that they push dirt into the hay. Your forage should be less than 9% ash if you have it analyzed. If you're over that, you're including dirt from soil, and recognize that that dirt is not beneficial. I've seen samples even from piles where they were scooping mud in with the silage in the spring and got up to 18 to 20% ash. That animal was not getting the amount of energy that it needed. So with that, I'll end and we'll see if we have any questions.
There we go. Excellent stuff, Dan. We do have a couple questions in the chat that came along a little earlier about inoculants. So can you comment on the use of salt in place of inoculant, or is that just a myth?
Salt is a feel-good product. It makes you feel like you're doing something when you're not.
So a bit of a myth.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Very good. And from Daniel Scott-Thorne, while in Europe, he saw a lot of formic acid silage, which seemed really good. And can you comment on this? And he says it was added at 5% on the harvester.
Sure. So adding acid to the silage, whether it's a bale or a bunker or tube, makes a good product. There's no question about it. In fact, the Europeans do that quite a bit, adding acid rather than inoculants. We haven't gone that route for 2 reasons. One is the formic acid even is hard on people and machinery. The other thing is that it's much more expensive than the bacterial inoculant. So it will make a good product. It's just a bit more expensive to use.
Okay, and so I'll open the floor up now. If anybody has any questions, they can put it in the chat. They could raise their hand or they can just jump in. And we did have another question just pop up in the chat. Any tips for wrapping what was meant to be hay but had to be baled early due to rain? And we've dealt with issues the last couple seasons with excess moisture during harvest time. So and they're saying around 25 to 30% moisture.
Yeah. So two answers to that. First off, you can wrap it with plastic and it works very well. If you don't want to use propionic acid, that would also be an alternative. Of course, you need the spray equipment on your baler to add it to the bale. So either propionic acid or wrapping is a good way to preserve hay that's made at 20 or 25% moisture. And you can kind of check a little bit what you're baling. Well, first off, if you bale it with a net wrap, that's helpful if you're going to wrap it because the net wrap holds the stems down. The problem we run into with hay at 20% moisture is that the stems are pretty tough and they will tear the plastic if you're not careful. But if you net wrap the bale first and then wrap it in plastic as part of the wrapping process, then that works very well.
Great. Question from Ben Roy. When looking at packing tractors, do you consider kilograms per square inch or just total kilograms? And what do you know about packing rollers they are selling?
So in theory, your packing weight per square inch is the important thing. I showed you a lot of tractors with duals on, and we oftentimes recommend not using duals to increase the weight per square inch. The reason people go to duals, though, is that it's a little more stable and few things like that. So yes, you're right. It's weight per square inch. Or what is that? Cubic centimeter? Oh no, square centimeter.
Kilograms per square. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think we're comfortable with square inches too. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I am.
And
Anyway,
what do you know? Sorry.
Go ahead. So
No, go ahead.
weight per square inch is the important thing. And we're also talking about going over the packing, driving back and forth over it a number of times. Was that the full question, or was there more?
The second part was about the packing rollers that they are selling.
Oh,
any thoughts on those?
Packing rollers are a good product. Anything that has weight and gives you good weight per square inch is a good idea. And like I said, I mean, frankly, I've seen people use the you know, those packing machines they use for roads with the rows of tires, and that works fine too. I've seen people use concrete trucks, you know, the tanks for hauling concrete and backing up and down piles, fill it with concrete and then use that to pack. Those are harder because you can't get good traction on the wheels, but yes, all of those products that give you good weight per square inch are helpful in packing.
Is it possible to overpack the pile?
No. I have seen some go up close to 800 kilograms per cubic meter. The main thing is that takes a lot of extra packing energy, and so it's a little more costly with no real benefit.
Okay, and here's a next question is probably a question everybody's asked themselves at one time or another. Is it better to keep baling in the rain if you're halfway through the field or leave it to get rained on?
Better to keep baling in the rain.
There you have it.
And that works fine. And then of course you would have to wrap some of that as it got wet. But and with wrapping machines, I get asked about that. The wrapping in the rain does not work because the plastic doesn't stick, it slides to itself. But you can haul the bales into some kind of a shed or overhead cover and then wrap them. Even if you're pulling them out of the rain, they'll wrap as long as the plastic is dry.
And more of a comment or suggestion.
Let me, interrupt one bit more. One more thought.
Sure.
An advantage of baling in the rain is that the hay holds on to the leaves better because it's tough. So you'll actually get more leaves than if you had baled it very dry. And that's a plus. And then, of course, if you left it till after rain, then you'd have to turn the windrows again. You'd shake leaves off. You would have a dry matter and a quality loss.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah. Another question or comment, I should say. Duals loaded with calcium will also help increase PSI, pounds per square inch, while packing.
Yeah, anything that gives you added weight. Absolutely.
So we're out of questions in the chat. If there's any questions, people can chime in now or raise their hand. I just had, I guess, more of a comment than anything is I'm really curious about the chop length doesn't matter. It's one of those things intuitively you would think it's going to pack better at a smaller chop length. And there's always discussion around silage quality as related to chop length, but it really has no impact on the packing.
It doesn't, it's like everything else. A little bit is okay, more is bad.
Yeah.
So what I was suggesting was we could go up to 8 or 10 centimeters. It doesn't affect packing. If we go over that, it has a huge impact.
And at the much smaller sizes, does it pack better?
And the much smaller sizes do technically pack a little bit better, but the difference between a 1 centimeter cut and a 4 centimeter cut in packing density are much less than the factors I presented. But it does take a lot more energy to cut the
And a lot more
shorter.
energy. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
We have a
Gary, can
question,
you hear me?
Jonathan? Yep, go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah. We just having a conversation here internally, and what do you, with a forage harvester, what do you recommend for chop length in inches? We're all old here. Well, except for maybe one guy.
Well, or Canada, we use a combination of metric and standard.
So for corn silage, it's pretty well worked out. If we do not have a crop processor, we'd recommend a 1 to 1.5 centimeter chop length. If we have a crop processor, we can go a little over 2 to 2.5 centimeters. If we're talking about grass or alfalfa, then chopping anything around 1 to 2 centimeters. 2 centimeters is a good length. You know what we're looking for is you want effective fiber along with the digestibility. Excuse me, John, I interrupted you.
No, I guess, kind of, Ross was suggesting that, like, years ago, he used to like aim for chopping like 3/4 of an inch. 3/8 or 3/8.
Theoretical G.
Is that too much or?
Too small.
Yeah,
Well, that's awful short. And again, you're taking more horsepower to do that, but you're also losing effective fiber. If you ever look at using any of these particle separators and measuring the distribution of size, and you'll always get a range of size because some pieces go in straight and some go in sideways. You want at least 10% over, let's see, I got to think about that, over 4 inches, which would be about 10 centimeters. So you want some length to get good rumination.
Like a lot of dairy guys, you chopping.
What?
A lot of dairy guys.
Okay, I think we got his answer for him there. Thank you. Another question just jumped into the chat there. How do you feel about opening a bunk to put the next cut on the face? If you do, is it better to do the entire bunk or do a wedge shape?
So first off, it's a bad idea. So let's look at the least bad idea. And of that, the least bad idea, the reason it's a bad idea is because when you open it, you're putting oxygen back in there and you're starting the heating process. So it's a less bad idea if you just do a wedge on the face than if you open up the whole bunker and expose it to air.
So if those are the worst, what's the best?
Well, I mean,
30 centimeter
sometimes you
cut.
have to. Let's start with that. But I would do a wedge if I were adding to an existing bunker. The other thing is that some farmers will have a different bunker or start a different pile for the next cutting. And then you don't have to open up an existing pile. So it depends on what the individual has available to them.
Okay. So we'll have a few more minutes left if there's any burning questions?
Hello.
Hello, Alan?
I understand that in Europe, some of the farmers use a thin sheet of plastic on the wedge pile, and then if they're starting to cut another cut, they all just pile on top of that thin sheet without opening the pile.
Well, that certainly, if we don't open the pile, that's better. The problem is how to feed out of that bunker with a layer of plastic in the middle. And, you know, I presume that they're sort of scraping off, but you have to, I've not seen that, to be real honest, but I'm curious about how that would work with that layer of plastic in between the two layers of silage in terms of removing the silage to feed it.
With a block cutter, you're not dealing with a lot of silage at once, so I think they just pull that plastic out after they dump it off. Yeah.
I see. Well, I've not seen data on that, and I can't answer. I'm a little bit negative in terms of that it being cost effective. I can see where it would reduce the oxygen in the silage down below. The question is, it's not going to eliminate it. Would it be enough to justify the cost of the plastic and the extra effort?
Yep. Another question I have, sometimes when I pile my round bales side by side, I'll get a bit of spoilage where they've been touching. Is it better to separate the bales, allowing air to keep the bale cool?
So these are unwrapped bales.
These are wrap bales.
Wrap bales still best where they touch.
Yeah, a small dinner-sized plate of spoilage there.
Trying to think, I've not really heard of that problem. What could be happening? So you just, I mean, so the other thing would be if you're going to store individually wrapped bales, it's best to store them in a long line facing east-west, north-south. No, I said that wrong. North-south, so that the sun rises on one side and sets on the other. If you have an area that the sun never gets to, then that affects the water content within the bale and can cause some of the issues that you might be looking at. So consider, a lot of farmers will put them end to end in a north-south line, and so the sun rises and sets over it and covers all sides over time.
Yep. Right.
Hey, thank you.
So here
Jonathan,
in
I
the booth
see
here,
your, yeah, go ahead, Jonathan, I think.
We had a question about, what kind of grasses would Dan recommend for silage for beef cattle, or what species?
Repeat the question, please, Gary.
What grass species would you recommend for silage for beef cattle? In Nova Scotia, I presume.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly aware that your history is brome grass and timothy, and well, I'll just say it. I don't recommend either one of those. They're both winter hardy, which is a plus. But it and maybe for beef it's okay. Both of them have about 70% of their growth on first cutting and not so much the rest of the year. So you can't get any kind of a uniform mix with legumes, for example. Timothy's a good one if you have wet soils. There's been some breeding effort on that. Also for beef, I would recommend, frankly, brome grass is slow to establish, which is an issue. I would recommend a tall fescue. You can get the endophyte free. The main thing is you want to pay attention to winter hardiness. Talk with whoever you're buying the seed from or look at trials. The winter hardy types are good, but there are many varieties that are not winter hardy and wouldn't make it there or here. So tall fescue.
What are your thoughts on Festoliums?
On what?
Vestuloliums, what are your thoughts?
Yeah,
Well, they're a good high quality forage. They too have quite a range in winter hardiness. But even there, I tend to look at them as more of a 2-year crop. And if I want a longer live pasture, then I'll, for example, plant those maybe as a cover to come up with the longer live species. So if you wanted brome grass, you could plant Festolium with the brome grass, take a cutting of Festolium and then come in with the brome grass. But I still think you'd be better off. Festolium is a good high yielding, quick developing and quick recovering crop. It's just not going to be very long lived like a fescue or timothy or brome grass.
thank you.
Thank you. And
But
we did have another.
question here.
Oh,
I should
go ahead,
just give the
Jonathan.
computer to
Yeah, you go
Ross.
ahead.
If, you've made hay, dry hay.
Can you hear Ross?
I can just hear him. I might have to repeat the question.
If you're making dry hay, how soon can you wrap it? Keep it.
Did you get that, Dan?
No.
If you're making dry hay, how soon can you wrap it after making it?
If you're making dry hay, so you can wrap. If first off, I wouldn't put a solid plastic cover on dry hay. I would just use a net wrap, and then you could put the hay up depending, as I showed you on that bale size and time of year, something between 16 and 18% moisture. If you're going to wrap them in plastic, then you'd want to bale them at 20% moisture or more, and then the wrap bale will keep its moisture. The bale without wrapping will gradually dry out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And we've one final message in chat. I think it's more targeting our department, but Ben needs 300. He calculates he needs 365 feet of bunk to take off 30 centimeters per day and have enough bunks for the cuts. So he's asking if maybe the department has programs coming out for that. So if our programs haven't opened yet, they're going to open in April. We'll have to wait and see what comes out in that, but I would encourage you to reach out to your local ag rep and have that conversation, and we'll see what happens come April. So with that, we have hit 1:30. Unless there's no final quick questions, we will thank Dan Undersander profusely for the entire series that he has presented to our Nova Scotia farms. I think you've expanded my mind on forage, silage, and storage, and some really good common sense, boots on the ground information that I think people will be able to translate, immediately into the field this spring. So thank you very much on behalf of our department and on behalf of Perennia and all of the participants, people that have taken place. It was really some terrific information. As I said,
You're welcome, and I enjoy working with all of you.
It's wonderful. And anytime you want to come this way, next time we'll get you to Cape Breton, and we'll tour you around the Cabot Trail and see what you think about that.
Yeah, I've been around Nova Scotia 2 or 3 times, but I've not been up in your country very much. I'd like to do that.
Very good. We'll make a point of it. As I mentioned at the beginning, these sessions have been recorded and they will be made available on the Perennia website. Scotia will be putting together a survey that will get sent out to everybody so we can get feedback on this on these sessions. And if you have any suggestions for future sessions, whether it's virtual or in person. Dan, you had mentioned about providing that packing spreadsheet. I'm interested in receiving it.
I've already got emails from other participants who are interested, so definitely we're gonna have to get you to follow through on that.
Well,
So
you know what
I
I
have
was thinking?
Sasha's email, but I don't have yours, Gary. Can you depend on her?
Absolutely, I can depend on her 100%.
I
I'm
thought
thinking,
As
maybe.
long as it's not a Monday morning.
I'm thinking, Scotia, what if we tied the spreadsheet to the survey? So if you want the spreadsheet, you have to fill out the survey, and that way it'll entice people to give us feedback on these sessions. We won't be that rigid, but we really want you to fill out the survey so we can get feedback. And if you do that, we'll definitely get you that spreadsheet, the packing spreadsheet.
Absolutely. And
So
I just
thank you
want to
all.
take an extra second to thank Dan. This is the second year in a row me and Dan have done some workshops together, and you're a joy to work with. And whoever said don't ever meet your heroes clearly didn't work in Forage Agronomy.
Well done. And
All
I'll leave
right.
the last word to you, Dan.
Well, thank you. It's very kind. So we see y'all. Have a good week.
We'll see you
A
all.
year.
A good season. Thank you very much.
Dan.
Thanks, everybody.